Welcome everyone to a KCOR presentation on the Canadian energy history. This is being presented by John Meyer, who is our first guest speaker on this series of Canadian Club of Rome Wednesday Zoom conferences. A little bit about John. He is the president of the Canadians for a Sustainable Society, and has been very much involved in Canadian energy issues. He has written this book, and which is, of course, on the bottom of the first slide for a link. And some of the material he is presenting is taken from this book, The Renewable Energy Transition, Realities for Canada and the World. So, John, if you want to proceed,
okay.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Art. Canadian energy history. Energy has been more vital to the formation of Canada than most nations because it literally built the nation. We could not have had a nation without it. And unlike a number of other countries in more southern climes, we could not have created a sophisticated country, sophisticated society without a great deal of fossil fuels. And this isn't necessarily completely germane to the talk, but it's my favorite cartoon. And we need to get serious. We need to move the national discussion away from money metrics, GDP, and start counting social and biophysical economic or biophysical issues in real physical units. And here I think you see the conundrum that people can't get their, can't move away from the GDP metric no matter what the environmental warning signs are. Okay, pre-contact, before Europeans arrived in the Americas, this was the population density in various areas. If you look down at the bottom here, down in central Mexico, you could have Central America. The environment could support possibly 100 people per square kilometer. The other extreme, up in the Canadian Arctic, perhaps there was one person per 700 square kilometers. So the population of 2,000 Inuit across a region of 1.4 million square kilometers. For reference, in 1500, the year 1500, Western Europe had a population of 90 million in an area of about 1 million square kilometers. So latitude matters, climate extremes matter in the ability of a population to maintain itself and to prosper. And that's essentially what this says. In southern Ontario, the density of people might have been one person per square kilometer. The population of Canada, pre-contact, might have been in the 500,000 region, with the majority of those concentrated in the lower BC coast area. The most sophisticated society that was developed in North America was the Cohakian society, about 600 kilometers further south than the furthest southern extension of Canada. And that collapsed, I believe, around 13 or 1400 AD. So population density is dependent on climate and the resources at hand, and Canada was largely empty for a reason, for good energy and biophysical reasons. The development of Canada began in earnest when Europeans arrived with their iron tools. Steel axes and saws gave them the ability to really exploit the huge standing resources that existed that had not been exploited by the Amerindians because they didn't have the tools to build up their population. So when Champlain, Samuel de Champlain, made his first settlement of Quebec in, I think, the 1630s. He arrived with 24 men, and by spring, all but 8 were dead. And thereafter, they spent immense amounts of time cutting firewood. The average temperature in Quebec City in January is 18 degrees colder, 18 degrees Celsius colder than it is in Paris. So we had the new tools. We were able to build safe housing and heat it, and that enabled us to develop the farmland. When we started to develop coal, then we were able to create rail transport industry, and we were able to push settlement into areas that wouldn't previously have supported it. And of course, oil came along, gave us a tremendous network of ground and air connections. Essentially, it gave us anywhere, anytime capability, so we could go and set up any kind of development anywhere we wanted to. And electricity allowed the industrial capacity to become more sophisticated and gave us comfortable living conditions for residential and farm basically anywhere in the country by about 1920. So that's the progression of energy. One thing I found fascinating in doing the researching the book, and I got some of the data from this book by Richard Unger, if anyone knows him, and John Thistle. It's energy consumption in Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries. And if you look at this, basically the real data starts around 1800, but it probably held up back to the 1650s when European settlement first started. The Inuit, of course, used very little energy because they had access to very little seal oil, this kind of thing. There was no wood available for them, very little firewood. The forest Amerindians would have used more energy because they were surrounded by energy, but they really couldn't access it outside of branchwood. They had no means of cutting cordwood, so they couldn't apply industrial exploitation techniques to the resources that were just standing around them. But here we see basically the kilowatt, the energy consumption staying basically about the same up to 1950. And what changes, I believe, is that we moved from firewood to the newer fossil fuels, more sophisticated fossil fuels. And although we weren't using more energy, we were using it much more efficiently. So that's basically the process of development, using the same amount of energy more efficiently. We went from open fires to hearths, to fireplaces, to wood stoves, and then we started to get into oil stoves, and of course we finished up with natural gas boilers, which are now about 95, say call it 95, 96% efficient. The burning fires in an open burning wood in an open fire, branch wood in an open fire. I can't imagine what the efficiency was, but it's probably down 2% or something. Okay. So the reality of a northern location, northern region, there are two factors. One is the ability to gather energy, and the other is the demand for energy. Here we see a nice ideal curve. The monthly average temperature in Guadalajara, Mexico, and they don't need heating systems. In Igloolik, the maximum temperature, maximum average monthly temperature is about 11 degrees, so that every day of the year, except of course for those exceptional days now that they see up to 30, basically every day of the year they need heat to warm their residences. So they need that year round, and it becomes extreme in the probably for about 5 months of the year: November, December, January, February, March. And that is offset unfortunately, in the summer, the capacity factor, if you have a photovoltaic system, in the summer, you get probably decent power output from it in Igloolik, but virtually nothing for 5 months a year, very, very low output for 5 months a year. Whereas in Guadalajara again, you've got fairly consistent solar output throughout the year. So here, what does this mean when we only have maybe 6 months where you can get decent solar output? It means that you've got to have storage. You've got to have a huge amount of storage to support yourself, and that storage is only available in fossil fuels. So fossil fuels built the North. There isn't any other system that offers the energy density and the storage capacity of fossil fuels, and they enabled settlement in the extreme climate of the Canadian North. Here's another way of looking at it. Guadalajara, 0 heating degree days. I haven't dealt with, by the way, of the issue of air conditioning. Wilmington, North Carolina will be coming to them more, but they've got a really nice balance of solar capability and consistent solar capability and low heating demand. Toronto, one of the southern areas of Canada, you've got maybe 3,700 degree heating days, and it continues as you go further north. The demand for energy is just dependent on the latitude, and of course this isn't consistent across the world. The European countries, many of them are further north of Canada's main population centers, but they have the added advantage of the Gulf Stream, which gives them far more moderate climate. And here, residential energy budget broken down into kilowatt hours per day. I'm doing everything in kilowatt hours per day per person, per capita. So that's natural gas, oil, wood, electricity, hydro, everything built into that. And that's what I think we need. We need a unified measure of the energy we use every day to determine what our energy budgets are in this country. So Canada, Norway, very northern. We spend a lot of energy heating our homes. Down in India and Brazil, very little. So I'm guessing this is about 2 kilowatt hours per day in India, and let's call it 34 kilowatt hours per day in Canada. And Spain, I guess Pedro isn't going to be on this. He was my research, he helped me immensely with the book, Pedro Prieto. This is why people go south, because you don't have to spend much to live well. Okay, total energy consumption hours per day. This is for the country as a whole, per capita. It also includes the immense amount of energy we spend on fossil fuel, the oil and natural gas sectors in Alberta and out west. So and as it does for Norway, they have a huge oil sector. So if you look at this, India, I don't have a figure here, but I'm guessing that would be about 20 kilowatt hours per day or less. And compare that, their total energy consumption is about half of what we spend heating our homes. That's one of the factors of, inherent factors of a southerly climate. If your energy budget in Canada were, if you were an individual with an energy budget of maybe 100 kilowatt hours a day, if you could stay alive, this is for all inputs, food, housing, heating, transport, all your material goods, say 100 kilowatt hours a day in Canada, you may not be able to survive. If you could, you would be very poor. If you had 100 kilowatt hours a day at your disposal in India, you'd be rich. Okay, the problem of seasonal storage, this becomes critical. Let's look at the bottom. Well, let's go across the top. The annual budget, energy budget in Guadalajara per person, I've set it 1,825 kilowatt hours a year. That's all the energy they use per year for their housing, or sorry, for their total energy consumption. And they need very little storage because they're going to get sun every day. In Igloolik, you have a massive energy demand, and you don't have an energy input every day. Now, I'm doing this for solar. People will say that you could do wind, but wind is also highly variable, not seasonally variable, but there are long periods in the winter in the north with very little wind, which surprised me. So I'm just using this, using solar as to make the point. And so you need an immense amount of storage, and you need a large array of photovoltaic panels, so that when the sun does come up, you can charge those batteries. And down in Guadalajara, you don't need a large array because the sun's coming up tomorrow, every day, all through the year. So Tesla Powerwalls, if you wanted to have that amount of storage, 4,800 kilowatt hours, and you were going to do that with Tesla Powerwalls, you would spend about $4 million to create that. The array and the inverters, et cetera, would probably be in the neighborhood of $125,000. So your total cost would be well over $4 million per residence in Canada's far north. Compare that to Guadalajara, and again, you can live very well for very little. Wilmington, I mentioned Wilmington because they've got a moderate climate, moderate energy demand. They've got very little storage required because they do have decent solar capacity throughout the year, and they just don't need the storage. So that they come in at just moving, say, 1,000 kilometers south of Canada's border. You can see the difference in the investment you would need to live well. Okay, energy return on energy invested, critical metric. It's the ratio between the energy that you input into something to get an output of energy. In the glory days of Texas and Saudi gushers, 1 barrel of oil invested, the equivalent would get you an output of 100 barrels. No wonder gas was cheap and industry boomed. Now, as we turn to depleting fields and more difficult oil plays, the world oil industry averages around 17 to 1. You can still live extremely well on that in most parts of the world. And but then we come to the oil sands, and it's the lowest grade energy oil play, I believe, in the world currently in production. There may be small ones that are not very productive, even less productive, but basically, this is why the oil sands has perpetual problems. That's the fundamental. There are a lot of other reasons, but the fundamental reason is it's not a good source of energy. It's not productive. If you put oil sands are only made possible by inputting a huge amount of natural gas, of which we have a lot, and then we're putting out, we're exporting oil more as an oil product than as an energy product. So the oil sands just have some fundamental issues. Solar, this is a world average energy return on energy invested, and there's a lot of controversy about that. Some say it should be a lot lower. Solar in Canada is very much lower than that, whereas in the southwest US and the area regions, it could be much higher. Say the capacity factor in Calgary might be maybe 14%, whereas down in the US Southwest, you can get up into the high 20s and low 30s. So that's, and of course on the East Coast with the increased humidity, it tends to be lower even in the southern US. Wind around 15 to 1, so it's a good economic energy, economic investment. And for, according to Charles Hall, in World Energy and Wealth of the Nations, fabulous book, the energy required, the EROI required to maintain a semi-sophisticated society is about 8 to 1. Okay, back to the oil sands. This isn't directly related to energy, but it's related to money. And once you include remediation, the cost of remediation, the question is, what are we doing with the oil sands mining? This isn't, this oil sands is mining has much higher remediation costs in situ. The question is, are we making money yet? And when you include the legacy costs, this is dollars for all burden. Conventional oil makes money, natural gas makes money, including legacy costs. Oil sands, hard to see how we will ever make money in the oil sands as a net positive for Canada and the taxpayer.
John, could you talk very close to your microphone? The audio is very poor.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I maybe should have put on my headgear. Here's a slide from the Club of Rome, and it shows what financial and political problems we have when one region is very, very dependent on energy and the one sector. So politically and economically, this gives us large problems in dealing with our emissions reduction and any kind of economic broadening of our economy. Okay. EROI Mountain, the when we started off development, human development, I used the Inuit and their seal oil, very low EROI, a lot of effort to get a little energy, and firewood using stone implements. Again, huge amount of effort, very little energy output. Then we run into steel tools, steel axes and saws, and EROI starts to take off. Coal, it's very, we get immense energy payoffs for a little human effort. And the same with the big oil fields. But we've used up most of those resources, and it was using those resources that gave us the impetus to be able to generate the population growth that we have had, that we've done in the past 400 years. And also the ability to settle areas that we never would have settled without fossil fuels. Okay, now we're on the downslope of the EROI Mountain, and we're going to be using less rich energy reserves. And finally, we come down to the oil sands. Solar buffered is solar output with battery backup, which battery storage, which lowers the EROI, biofuels, ethanol, which is almost 1-to-1, etc. So that's the trend we're on, and we have to find a way of doing more with the energy that we will have, the lesser amounts of energy we'll have going forward. Is the coefficient of performance going to save us to some degree? And the answer is yes, to some degree. The coefficient of performance means, for a heating system, means that you will get more heat out than the energy you put in. So it's the reverse, essentially, of EROI. With an air-to-air heating heat pump, you would use, say, 1 kilowatt of electricity to produce maybe 4 kilowatts of heat inside the residence. Art system with his ground system, geothermal, it's certainly much more than that. Drake Landing, which is in Okotoks, Alberta, very well documented, great studies on that. They're using hot water to store heat in the summer and then use it in the winter. I think there's about 90 residences there, and they're getting coefficient of performance of around 30-to-1, which is just immense. This may be counterintuitive to a lot of people, but this borehole geothermal storage in Okotoks, they're drilling down about 100 feet, and their column of earth is about 30 meters wide, so 100 feet again. And this whole column of heat, a column of earth, they're heating up over the summer, and they're drawing that heat. It gets up to over 50 Celsius, and over the winter, they're able to pull that heat out. And of the heat that they deposit, they get 45% of the heat back. So it's 45% efficient, which is immensely good. If you compare the cost of battery storage, electric battery storage, to the cost of borehole technology, geothermal, the cost of the geothermal is about 0.6% of the cost of battery storage. So this makes energy storage real for Canada, and we have to have something going forward with renewables, because renewables are electric, and we have no means of storing electric power in the at the level we need them over the winter. So heat storage, low-grade energy storage is a distinct possibility here. And from my point of view, I see it as one of the main factors that will allow us to go forward. Again, this isn't directly associated with energy, but when all Canadians, I'm sure, look at the possibility of cutting our emissions nationally, I think we've always thought that we can just do a better job of tending our forests, we can regrow our forests, etc., and we can use them as a carbon sink. That, given the vagaries of climate change with beetle infestations and fires, warmer climate, drier climate in some areas, our forests are actually emitting carbon, are net emitters. The oil sands, this is megatons of CO2 equivalent. The oil sands are about 100, I think, now. So you can see the scale at which the forests are actually losing carbon as opposed to helping us. So that's, I see as a huge disappointment and a big problem. Okay, so moving into the electrical future on renewables, what does it look like? Instead of trying to create an equivalent amount of energy to what we use in the fossil fuel era, the electrical society will not need as much because we're going to be vastly more efficient. I'm saying we cut our domestic residential consumption immensely, which would be easy to do with heat pumps. Electric cars are simply vastly more efficient than their internal combustion engine equivalents. And you put this all through the system, and where today we are using, say, over 50,000 kilowatt hours for this particular lifestyle, in the electronic renewable energy world, we'll be using vastly less. So that's just an example of some of the things we can take advantage of moving forward, rather than trying to recreate the amount of energy that to equal what we do now and what we consume now in the fossil fuel world. The grid becomes a living organism almost. Instead of having the generator, one generator, transmission line, consumer, you have many different inputs: natural gas, solar, wind, hydro. The grid will be able to store, possibly using hydrogen or pumped storage, which is backwards hydro, and maybe large-scale battery backup, as they're doing in Australia. And at the consumer end, we will be producing energy with solar panels, maybe wind. We'll be able to store energy with hydrogen locally. We might have our Tesla power walls in our houses. We can have, with our vehicles, we can have our electric vehicles store energy and pump back into the grid. This is vehicle to grid, V2G. The Nissan Leaf has this capability. And we'll be doing a lot of thermal storage. So we will be able to put energy back into the grid, and it'll be a two-way street, huge amounts of storage, and mitigate our curtailment simply won't be a factor. Any energy developed anywhere will not go to waste or sold cheap to the Americans. We can store it. Okay, so talking all these technicalities about these beautiful energy systems we're going to create, but there have been a number of fiascos associated with energy, driven by energy, social fiascos generated by energy. Syria, that was a big part of it. That might have been the fuse that set things off. That's what in Syria, with their high population growth over the last 6 decades and drought, and then the government cut fuel subsidies because they couldn't do it any longer. In France, the French poured into the streets over a 5% increase in the tax on diesel. And we all know about the Ontario green energy fiasco, where people were getting upset about what they thought they were paying for green energy, which simply wasn't the case. It was just horribly bad media coverage and exploitation by a political party. So here in Canada, northern country, unsurprisingly, the poor and lower income spend a higher proportion of their incomes on energy. Same with Sweden. And if you go to the Mediterranean moderate countries, you see a vastly less percentage of income spent on energy, and it's not that badly distributed. But the point is, if you can't make energy conversion, we're going to be paying more for energy when we go renewable. It's going to cost, and the pain has to be spread out. And governments have to recognize this, that maintaining energy equality has to be a key consideration. And I point out the Netherlands, which is doing an absolutely superb job. I don't know whether it's accident or on purpose. For whatever reason, they're a relatively northern country, and look at that energy equality. That would be worthy of a study in itself. By the way, I wanted to say again, some of this data is from Richard Unger's book, Energy Consumption in Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries. Just a tremendous find of a book. I couldn't buy it on Amazon or anywhere else. I had to track down Richard, who's retired, and send him a $20 bill in the mail to get his book, but it's beautiful. Okay, policy priorities. I think Art was looking for silver bullets here, and I don't really have silver bullets except to say that the EVs, going to electrical vehicles, the easiest, fastest, biggest payoff for carbon reduction. And they also, I believe, to be are now financially the way to go. In areas which are starting to get, like Britain and Norway, starting to get a much higher percentage of EVs, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to sell an internal combustion vehicle used. So that's a factor. We need to get young hands and minds working on real systems, and I think we need test and development systems all over the country, like Art's system, only in a container, sort of, say, it's Art containerized and shipped all over the country so that kids can get their hands on it and deal with photovoltaic, wind, solar, hot air, hot water, insulation, external blinds, you name it, open software, and they can get a feel for this. They have to get their hands on this. We need energy audits for every building using a standardized overall energy consumption, and I'm saying that should be kilowatt hours because people have no idea how much energy they actually use. The natural gas doesn't cost much. Per energy, it uses, it gives about, well, let's see, 6 times, in Ontario it's about 5 or 6 times the amount of energy per dollar. So people think they're not using much energy, but they actually are when they're using natural gas. We need to apply our tremendous ability to drill holes in the earth to geothermal storage instead of trying to suck oil and natural gas out. And we have to settle the landlord-tenant conundrum to be able to support move to energy efficiency. It's a very difficult issue, but government has to lead the way with some kind of policy to allow investment to reduce consumption, because right now the landlords don't care and the tenants aren't going to invest in energy reduction technology. We need to stop making buildings which can't be retrofitted, and we need to have a program in place which deals with retraining across the country. Alberta oil workers is an example. We have a good program there. And Germany is also doing something similar with coal workers, but there's going to be a huge transition. And we need, like energy equality, we need to protect the people, or it's going to spill out onto the streets and be chaotic, and chaos doesn't lead to a smooth transition. So, thank you.
Okay, John, we've got a couple of questions here, but I would like to take my prerogative of being the host to ask clearly the issue is one of obstacles to moving forward. I don't believe you find anyone on this conference that would say we have to do a transition, but the world of obstacles is there, and it is multi-dimensioned. And it's interesting to see all the speculation that's now on the internet talking about how we can use the COVID pandemic to go and say, hey, we've got unemployed people by the score. Clearly, we can put them to work doing green energy things. But we're still confronted with policy and other obstacles. Have you had any recent thoughts on that, on how particularly Canada may move forward and beat whatever these obstacles are?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons that the green energy policy in Ontario failed. It wasn't a bad policy. It had its lumps, but anything new is going to have lumps. And unfortunately, they get exploited way out of proportion. But one of the principal concepts was that we would make solar panels and wind generators in Ontario. Great idea. That's what we need to do. But our free trade agreements won't allow us to do that. So in a globalized world, we can't do it because we can't compete with dollar an hour labor. We can't compete with their environmental standards. We can't compete under rigged exchange rates. So countries have to step back from this globalization, maximize consumption paradigm that we're under. And I think the pandemic has been good for that, because all of a sudden, if we want medical supplies, we realize that we have to go to China for it. And we can thank heavens that the Chinese only had 100,000 infected as opposed to 100 million, because if they had 100 million infected, we would be getting zero medical supplies out of them and out of India as well. So we have to recognize that we need a broad-based economy, and we have to be able to control our own production of energy, and then we can move forward.
Okay, very, very good. And I'm dashing. Oh, here's Ruben. Ruben, you're next. Would you like to start your video and ask your question? You're muted. You've muted yourself, Ruben. There we go.
Sorry, I'm having some trouble with my computer. The place I wanted to start was a question I put in the chat box, and it was just about the population of Amerindians at contact, and the assertion that Canada was basically empty. I'm just, the impression I get from other sources is that there were several millions of people in North America, many of whom were killed by European diseases, the figure is often quoted up to 90%. What do you make of that?
Oh, that's correct. I mean, not so much in Canada, the high population, but certainly in eastern U.S. And certainly throughout Central America and South America. I think there was something like 60 to 90 million Amerindians, and through disease, war, displacement, we managed a genocide on the level of 95%. So yeah, absolutely, that's what happened. In Canada, though, there just weren't that many people to kill. But disease was the principal cause of the decline, but we displaced them off the best land. And I think Charles C. Mann, it's called, book is called 1491, The Condition of the Americas Pre-Contact. Great book. And it deals exactly with your point. So Canada wasn't densely populated, but Eastern North America may have been the initial explorers from Europe landing on the eastern seaboard, reported very high levels of population density. And then when they came back in the 1600s, there was virtually nobody there. That was because of the disease. So that it wiped out all of these groups. And they had built, they had terraformed the country with walnut trees, various trees in plantations. And we just walked through that and not realizing that we were walking through an abandoned farm ineffectively. So anyway, that's, yes, exactly to your point.
Thank you.
Okay, the next one, Ted Manning, go ahead, you're unmuted.
I think John has already made the point that I happen to have done my master's degree in Mexico on man-land relationships and the die-out of the Mayan civilization. And I can confirm that that there was major collateral kill of associated with the arrival of Westerners in that part, probably much more so than other parts of North America, which were mainly rather sparsely settled. The problem was with those civilizations, they were also self-terminating by overpopulation, by overexploiting their resources, and they were in pretty rough shape before the Europeans came and wiped out the rest of them. So there's a whole suite of reasons why the Mayan and the Aztec and other civilizations collapsed. And they're very similar to the kinds of things we're talking about these days in terms of climate change, in terms of overpopulation, in terms of virus kill.
Yeah, well, population cycles happen everywhere. And, you know, it's just that we've only recorded a small number, but I think population cycles are inherent in any human society.
Okay, and the next one we have is Rob Hoffman. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, Rob.
Yeah, hi, John. Thanks very much for your presentation. It's a great overview, both in time and space. My question relates to freight transportation, particularly heavy diesel trucks. You didn't make much mention of that segment where emissions are very high and growing. In fact, they're probably greater now than emissions from the passenger vehicle fleet. Can you say a few words about that? I also have asked you about the concept of EROI. I've always argued that this is a bit of a concept that is rooted in comparative statics, and it supposes that energy in any carrier is of equal value.
Yeah.
Clearly not the case.
Yeah, I think when I related the renewable society electric economy to our current fossil fuel economy, I think you can see that energy is different, has different values, different uses. And I haven't gotten into that as much as you have, I know with your what-if modeling, but it's a critical issue. And there are a lot of critical issues that we aggregate when we look at everything. EROI in itself, Charlie Hall's 8-to-1 for a sophisticated society, it doesn't allow for latitude, and 8-to-1 makes you rich in Mexico and maybe dead in Winnipeg. So there's just a huge number of facets to the energy discussion that need to be covered, and I think with modeling is the only way to do it, to put all our assumptions down in one body of work, and so we can examine them. Diesel trucks, haven't spent any time on it. I just know that if there's no diesel, the economy stops. That's it. And hopefully we can get away from that kind of energy increase that we've been experiencing there with electric trucks, et cetera. But that's the extent of my knowledge. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that there's an interesting experiment in Alberta with using hydrogen-powered heavy trucks.
Right.
And they're actually building some vehicles that will be capable of long-distance freight on a single fueling of hydrogen. Yeah,
hydrogen might work in that application. To me, it's very lossy. I think on the order of it might be life cycle efficient, might be 25-30% efficient. So no better than the internal combustion engine, but it could work if you've got large point-to-point applications like trains or maybe trucks. For the private vehicle fleet, I just don't see it.
Well, they're even talking about pipeline infrastructure for moving hydrogen.
Yeah, again, I guess I'm not a complete cynic on hydrogen, but I'm a little bit skeptical because it's difficult to handle, corrosive, and I think we have to run it. It's about 10,000 psi, and it just on an energy basis, I just see battery electric as so much more efficient than hydrogen. Where you're looking at 80s and 90s% life cycle efficiency compared to down in the 30s.
John Meyer, could you turn your video on so that we can see you? Give you a little.
Oh, my little light went off. What happened to am I back?
There you are.
Yes,
okay.
you are.
How long has it been off?
Too long. Anyway.
Sorry.
For most of question period. In any event, John Legg is the next on the list, and he's the last one I have. So if you have a question, please send me a chat message and I'll schedule you in. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thank you, Art. And John Meyer, I'd like to echo the thanks from others. I will just read out a few of the questions I typed there, and it was near the end of your presentation. You talked about the landlord-tenant coordination problem.
Yeah.
My wife and I moved into a rental about 3 years ago, and I get the impression that the rather large empire called Urbandale Construction, well, it's really Urbandale Inc., and they own in the hundreds of rental units, but I get the impression they are quite happy to simply collect the rents and do the minimum in terms of any kind of environmental initiative. So what is the problem? And who, when I say who, I mean what, I suppose this is a provincial thing. So what would be the agency or the department within, let's say, the government of Ontario who might help out this? And are you aware of any contacts within government to get this thing going? But you're going to have to explain the problem to begin with, please.
Yeah, well, the problem is that landlords, tenants are billed for energy typically, and so they have to pay for their own energy. They have no means of making an investment in the property to reduce their energy consumption because they're probably not going to be there that long. They're probably also, the landlord wouldn't let them start making renovations. If you were to put exterior blinds on your windows, you know, the landlord probably wouldn't allow that. And the landlord, because he doesn't pay for energy, has no incentive to invest. So I think that what is needed, and in terms of government, I mean, if they could figure out something, a way to approach this, I'm sure they would appoint somebody to look after it, but I don't think they have figured out how to approach this. My suggestion would be that we charge a surcharge on tenant consumption, and so the tenant ends up paying, which makes it tough. But that money is then given to the landlord in the form of grants to upgrade his property, either by generation, solar panels on the roof, insulation, you name it, heat pumps. But the money has to end up coming. There's only one source of income, and that's from the renter. So it has to go from the renter somehow into the through the pocket of the landlord, who will make the capital investment. And that's the only way I can see approaching it.
Okay, thank you. No.
Well, I'm glad to see Pedro Prieto is on here. Fabulous, Pedro, and was a huge help to me writing the book. And if you want an opinion on solar photovoltaic, Pedro would be more than happy to give it to you. So he's, I don't see that he's coming. Oh, okay, here he comes. Okay, Pedro,
Yeah.
can you say something?
Can you hear me well?
Poorly.
Oh, thank you, John, for your presentation. Thank you very much. Well, what could I say? Anything else? I mean, whatever you have said is about solar PV, especially in Canada, for instance, is quite sensible. I mean, even if you consider the EROI energy return on investment in Canada for solar PV, and if you consider it buffer, which is, I mean, with all other energy input ingredients, then it won't work properly. I mean, to sustain your present civilization. I mean, our present civilization there in Canada. I mean,
Art, I can't hear a darn thing. Can anyone else?
Oh,
can you hear me?
no.
No.
I can hear it. Need younger ears, I'm afraid.
Oh.
I'm completely deaf. Can you hear me?
Not very well, Pedro. Your volume is very, very low. If you could get closer to your mic, we might be able to hear you.
Let me, if I get now? No.
I think it's pretty well a bust on getting sufficient volume with you.
Yeah, sorry. Too bad.
Repeat.
Too
I
bad.
can
handle the volume. I'm afraid I ran out of batteries from my Bluetooth microphone.
Okay. I'll tell you what he said, okay? If that's okay, what he said was that given the energy inputs and outputs and required for investments for buffers and everything else, that basically solar in Canada is a bust. We just don't have the solar density to make the whole thing work.
Hello?
And we're all going to have to move to Mexico.
Okay. Good.
That's it.
Okay.
Well, I guess some people might want to debate that, but particularly myself. But however, it is possible. You get too far north, you start to lose your credibility.
Hello.
He's still trying to talk. Pedro, can you try one more time? I guess we're having audio problems with him. And we have Gordon. You had a question of your own, Gordon Kubinak.
Now, can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Pedro. Okay, it's still faint.
Sorry, my microphone is not working well.
That's okay now.
It's okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Pedro, at your loudest voice possible.
I'll try to shout. What I said is that solar probably won't support your present life system in Canada, solar PV.
Yeah. Okay, I tend to agree with that because in our globalized system, we're getting very, very cheap, energetically speaking, solar renewable energy infrastructure. And I've got a slide up. I don't know if it shows on the screen anymore. But basically, we're living on the luxury of Chinese coal. And when eventually Chinese coal runs out, which is about 30 years, they may not be able or willing to export huge amounts of energy embedded in material goods. And therefore, we will have to make them ourselves. And when we start to use Canadian renewable energy to make Canadian renewable infrastructure, Pedro, may well be proven right, or at least it'll be an issue that we haven't dealt with before.
Okay, Gordon, you're next. Gordon Kubinak. No, you don't seem to be responding. All right, Peter Menke, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, yes, I think I'm going. Yes. I just wrote in the thing. I've been doing a lot of work on circular economies lately. When you talk about manufacturing your own goods, but also there are a lot of energy things about using local resources to meet local needs, but rather than throwing away stuff, you can reuse it and so on, reducing the costs of extraction and energy costs. Have you included or thought about how a circular economy might help to achieve the goals that you have in mind?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the book, Art got 3 or 4 pages in the book, and another fellow, John Howe, I also looked at. John was much he's down in New England. He's passed away, unfortunately. But he looked at how much energy it took to, how many solar panels it would take to, in New England, to energize the plowing of a certain field. And you had to have lead acid batteries because they can be recycled, whereas our current batteries, becomes much more difficult. And he looked at questions like that. And without recycling, we're pretty much finished. Very, very highly effective recycling, we're pretty much finished. Chris Clugston put out a book called, what is it? Oh, geez. Anyway, he deals with the need for recycling and the availability of minerals, and he just shows that that we're coming to a crunch, and with a shortage of energy, that just makes the crunch come faster. So it has to be local and extremely high levels of recycling.
Okay, we have we had Gordon, but he obviously had to dash off. Ted, you had the last question.
It's just an extrapolation on the issue. Our entire economic system is not designed to make it easy for people like Minto or whoever the renters are. We have divided up responsibilities, and the people who gain the money aren't necessarily the ones who need to invest. I found particularly that resonated with me because I work a lot with the tourism industry. It doesn't exist much right now, but the hotels, your typical hotel is built by an investor in a country who wants a palace for himself to put his name on it, like Trump. And what he does, almost all the ones in Egypt, for example, are like that, and there are hundreds of them. And they're palatial, and they're built to last 5 years if they're lucky. And then what they're done is they're managed by someone like Hilton or Marriott for the first 3 years of their existence. If they are not built, there's really no demand. The running the property is done by the Marriott. They aren't going to make an investment unless they can get back their money in 3 years. The original owner isn't going to make the investment because they don't have to pay the energy bills. And really the whole system has been structured virtually to make it impossible to get people to work together to create good properties. The one exception is in the really high end, where the little island in the Maldives is selling paradise, and it's prepared to go solar to preserve that paradise and charge people $3,000 a night. But it's pretty hard to do in most of the rest of the industry. And the same thing's kind of true with office buildings and with fancy condos. The high end, you can get people to invest for lifestyle and visibility and pride and so on. But the rest, we have not structured the whole market in a way that makes it easier for people to work together to actually realize energy saving or any other kind of social benefits.
Yeah, well, that's a conflict between the finance system and different priorities, of course, and the energy system and the finance. We have to organize the finance system so decisions made in the financial system are energy rational, and that there's a huge number of facets to that. In Cuba, the resort I went to, talked to the manager, and they spent a huge amount of money. Their electricity rates are unbelievably high on showers for tourists. And I've got to say, I'm one of the guys who stands in the shower for a long time if I'm not paying for it. Okay, and so I went to him with a plan, and I said, look, Cuba, hot energy or hot water, extremely simple to do, very low investment. And I said, please look at it. And he looked at it. And in Cuba, their electrical generators are oil, imported oil, and they're massively inefficient. And it's just so messy. But he said, we wouldn't go for this because the electrical supplier, the utility, would be very upset with us if we started using less energy. And it becomes political. And you can't cross powerful interests in basically any country, and particularly in a country like Cuba. So
in Cuba, all the hotels are owned by Gaviota, which is part of the army. And they have a 20-year link to getting Venezuela oil until about a month ago when it was stopped coming.
Yeah, so good.
Okay, along the same line, Rob Hoffman had a comment. Rob?
Well, the comment I put in the chat box was responding to the circular economy concepts. And by and large, as they're popularly advocated, you can recover, reuse, etc., ad infinitum, unless you consider the second law of thermodynamics. So we should be talking about energy, of course, is conserved, the first law, but exergy is not. And by and large, any process that does useful work requires exergy. And because recycling requires exergy, it's not a perpetual motion machine, so to speak. There is no such thing as a perpetual motion machine.
Yeah.
So what is the half-life of any material?
Well, what you have to work with the trade-off between how much exergy is required to take your material from its natural sources versus how much exergy is required to recycle. And there is a trade-off, and is different for different materials. And obviously, since materials are also finite in the Earth's crust, this trade-off, changes as a function of time as well.
Okay, we have David as our last comment and question. We've been at this now a little over an hour, and we'll be winding up shortly. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, hi. Just to go back to something Ted Manning said a few minutes ago, what he described is, I believe, a market failure, and it could only be resolved through regulation. The terrible word that the Americans are trying to take out of our lexicon. If they succeed at it, we can't possibly solve the problem. And I think there are many other countries around the world that will, in fact, keep it in the lexicon, and they're the ones that give us some hope.
Well, I think we've seen that with COVID-19. The market didn't respond. The market didn't see it coming. The market's got no response. It's not within its cost structure. It doesn't benefit from sales. Unfortunately, there's no lobby saying, there's no pro-COVID-19 lobby. So it fell on government to see the threat, which was very obvious, particularly bodies in the halls in Italy, and governments responded. I mean, whoever thought Ford would stand up to a biophysical challenge like that? I mean, he's been solid, and so governments. Trump was standing up on the podium with two scientific experts, Birx and Fauci. Whoever saw that before? So there's hope. People like that. So that there's hope that governments can deal with these problems that the financial system, markets absolutely cannot.
All right, and what I would like to do then is call this recording to an end, and